Hi everyone, this is Professor Hai Nguyen, and I want to welcome you to my tutorial video for your first document-based question exam, right? So we call it the DBQ. So I apologize to you if I'm harking back to some old traumatic memories that you may have of the DBQ, right? So this is the dreadful DBQ, but the only difference is that this time around, unlike the ones that you took back in high school, I'm not going to lock you in some high school gymnasium for 3 hours, and it's not going to be somewhat a three-component section test, right? This is purely just about the documents. And what we're going to be doing in this video is that I am going to somewhat try my best to give you as much information as I can to help you somewhat be successful on the test. Basically, guys, just the do's and don'ts, right? When it comes to somewhat the DBQ. And also that way, avoid any confusion in terms of what the assignment is about. Because again, the challenge with somewhat the online course is that there's only so much that I can spell out. Look, at the end of the day, I want to be as concise and as somewhat clearly as I can to let you know what you're going to be doing for the exam. So just a quick recap here. I'm hoping that what you have learned so far from module 1, 2, 3, and also what you have read in the textbook, chapter 16 through 19. I hope you have enjoyed somewhat the content itself, right? What we started out was that in chapter 16, right, you started off somewhat with this movement that occurs in Europe. You have the scientific revolution. This is where you have guys like Copernicus and Galileo, right, really somewhat examining the universe and everything that operates around them. And it's actually really amazing that it starts out in the scientific community, and ultimately it expands, is that from the scientific community, you have ideas such as natural laws and somewhat the idea of the scientific procedure, right? Basing your conclusion on evidence, right? On somewhat observation rather than somewhat what the church says, right? In a sense, something we kind of take for granted and something that I would say we badly need right now as we are in the midst of somewhat of a pandemic. But you have these somewhat ideas, procedures, and somewhat understanding about how the universe works. And then eventually what you have is basically those procedures and ideas get applied to people and society and ultimately politics, right? And as a result, you have the Enlightenment Movement, okay, where you have philosophers all around Europe, but it's really in France. That is where somewhat the heart of the Enlightenment movement lies, with the French philosophies, right? Really somewhat shaping the ideas of natural rights, right? And really building the foundation for eventually what is going to become somewhat the revolutions in the late 18th century. Okay, so I hope you somewhat enjoy the history that you have learned about Western societies from around the late 16th century and as late as by 1815, so by the early 19th century or so. So we started off with the scientific revolution. You have Enlightenment ideals. But then if you look at somewhat the evolution of the transformation as European societies as well, is that because of the discovery of the Americas and because of Christopher Columbus, you have somewhat the beginning of somewhat colonization, right? This is the connecting of Europe, the Americas, but also sadly also of Africa as well, right? We're talking about the transatlantic slave trade that is going to import tens of millions of African slaves to the New World to provide the labor and also to create the wealth that is going to be the foundation of the modern day economy and also capitalism itself. So what you have is that Europe, prior to this time period, was somewhat kind of like this backwoods, feudal religious society that ultimately just came out of somewhat a deadly plague, had committed itself against somewhat this crusade against the Islamic Empire. But because of the discovery of the Americas and also the connecting of the three continents with the transatlantic slave trade, what you ultimately have is that Europe evolved, right? It evolved from somewhat that backwoods, feudal, religious society ultimately evolving into what? An expanding empire across the globe, right? Becoming somewhat more secular. And last but not least, Europe is going to become a superpower by somewhat the 19th century, okay? So you have evolution and you have transformation that really lays the groundwork for somewhat modern societies of today, okay? So this is where I want to take you to the class. And I share my screen here. Okay, so that's the history that you have learned so far. And what we're going to be trying to do is we're going to try to somewhat connect ideas, movements very early on, and then ultimately try to understand their impact, their legacies, and also how it inspires somewhat movements and revolutions ultimately. Because again, guys, in this class, yeah, this is the reason why I share the execution of Louis XVI, right, as somewhat the cover page of the class. Because again, it's really somewhat these revolutions that is somewhat the focal point of this class. And in this exam, what we're trying to understand is we are trying to understand the lead up to these revolutions, right? The factors that ultimately cause these revolutions to happen. Because if you look at it, as Europe transformed itself from somewhat this feudal, religious, somewhat societies, right, into somewhat this expanding, globalized, secular, global superpower. I don't know how many of you are a fan of Spider-Man, but Ben Parker, right? This is Peter Parker's uncle, right? Well, he had a saying, right? He says, with great powers comes great responsibilities. Or in this case, how it applies to somewhat these European monarchs is that the responsibilities was at home, not only to rule, but also to provide for their subjects, okay? And that's somewhat sort of the problem, is that you have somewhat these cultural movements, but also you have the expansion of the empire. And these monarchs, what they're gonna try to do is they are going to try to somewhat balance between somewhat this rising tide of somewhat of democratization, okay, but also maintaining their power as well, okay? And also with expansion comes conflict. Conflict leads to war, and then war, guys, costs a lot of money. And as a result, when monarchs run out of money, oftentimes it leads to rebellion at home. And that's what we're looking at, is that the events starting from 1776 all the way up until 1815 are not described in the history books as rebellions, right? When you have people, the masses, somewhat not cooperating, not following the authority of their rulers, okay? That's a rebellion. But there was something unique about what happens in North America and also in Europe, okay? Starting from 1776. And America in 1776, in France in 1789, and then we're going to shift back to somewhat the Caribbeans with Haiti in 1791. And these events, those years in particular, we don't describe it as somewhat a rebellion, okay, or a coup of some sort, but we describe it in the history books, right, as something very unique, something very different from previous somewhat uprisings, if you will. And as a result, this is why they're titled revolutions, right? There's 3 revolutions that ultimately we're going to be looking at in the late somewhat 18th century. We're looking at the American Revolution, we're looking at the French Revolution, and we're looking at the Haitian Revolutions, okay? And revolutions means change, right? Something changed. And ultimately, history, okay, as a discipline, as a field of studies, okay, and also as a skill, right? History is about tracking change over time. And ultimately, in this exam, that's what you're going to be asked to do. You will be asked to explain the correlations, the connection, right? The through line between somewhat events in Europe, okay, ideas, movements that occur in Europe, starting in about the late 16th century, as early as the late 16th century. And ultimately, you are going to try to connect and correlate, right, between ideas and movements in the late 16th century and how it shapes revolutions by the late 18th century, right, guys? Because for me, I'm really big and I'm really interested in this idea of basically ideas, right? Inspiring actions, right? Motivating people to somewhat strike for change in their society, okay? And that's what this exam is going to be about. So that's what you have covered, right? From module 1, 2, 3, and also from the reading itself, right? We started off in Europe around the late 16th century with the scientific revolution. You have the Enlightenment, and you ended somewhat by module number 4 with the French Revolution. And that's ultimately the connection that I'm asking you to somewhat do in this class. And in order for you to somewhat explain change over time, okay, and correlate those ideas that was born out of the late 16th century and how it inspired somewhat those revolutions by the late 18th century. In this exam, you are going to be asked to examine the history from that time period, but also, like those people very early on that somewhat base their conclusions on evidence, on somewhat observations, so will you. And this is the reason why this exam, guys, it's a document-based question exam, because what you're going to be doing is you are going to somewhat base your argument and your conclusion on evidence, right? Evidence. And your evidence in this case is something that I have assigned. These are primary resources that you're going to get to work with as a way for you to somewhat answer the question, okay? So let me try to get access to your quiz here. Okay, so let me pull it up here. Okay, so let's talk about the test, the format of the test, how you should prepare, and ultimately the do's and don'ts, right, when it comes to somewhat DBQ itself. So boilerplate stuff. This test itself will cover module 1 through 4. It will also cover the reading material from the textbook, chapters 16 through 19, okay? And you will have a 2-hour time limit. Now, I understand for some of you, like, oh my God, it's only 2 hours. But guys, here's the reality, is that the 2 hours is what you have to somewhat write the test. But you actually have 2 weeks to prepare for this exam. And again, I had emphasized to you since day number 1 in the orientation video that my assignments are not designed to be done last minute. So I am hoping, I am praying that you get access as soon as this exam is open and available to you. You get a head jump on this as soon as possible, because I promise you, this is not something that you can just click the night before or 2 hours before the test somewhat expire and you are going to be successful on it. Because again, guys, my expectations are high. At the end of the day, you will have to write an essay in a matter of 2 hours, okay? 1,000 words, so that's around 4 to 5 pages, double space. Typically in college, guys, 250 words is about a page of writing, double space, 12-point font, okay? But 1,000 words. And then on top of that, you will have to use at least 6 out of the 8 primary documents that I have assigned here on the exam page. And then on top of that, I am also letting you know what key terms are relevant in terms of your somewhat analysis. So you got to do a lot of things here, guys, right? You have to write a 1,000 word essay minimum, okay? And then on top of that, use effectively. The key word here is effectively, right? 6 out of the 8 documents I assign. And then last but not least, right? Use the key terms as part of your analysis, okay? To tell a comprehensive story. look, at the end of the day, guys, I want you to think of this kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, okay? The documents themselves, those are the big piece, right? They are the big piece, okay? Big topics that I'm hoping for you to analyze and explain and relate back to the essay question, okay? The key terms that you see down below, okay? Well, we'll get to the key terms down below. The key terms, about 20 key terms down below, those are kind of like smaller pieces that you can attach to the bigger piece. And then what I'm hoping is that your essay will be able to put all the big pieces and small pieces together to tell a cohesive, smooth narrative about how basically, guys, not to give it away or anything, how the Enlightenment somewhat inspired the revolutions by the late 18th century, right? So that's what it's about, guys, okay? But again, it's not that you only have 2 hours to work on this thing. No, you have a 2-week window to work on it. So I really recommend that you spend as much time as possible because this is not an easy task, guys, okay? So let's talk about the documents that you get to work with, okay? So document number 1 here, what you have is a treatise. Yeah, you're gonna read a lot of treaties. And these are not like war treaties or anything, right? Treaties at this time was basically just another word for pamphlet, right, in a sense. What you have here is a piece of writing from the famous somewhat philosopher, right, Voltaire. Now, I'm not gonna somewhat analyze too deep into what Voltaire says here because that is your job to do, okay? But what I'm hoping for you to extract from the writing of Voltaire is understand how he was a reflection, right? And through his writing, an expression of the Enlightenment ideas. That's basically it, guys. Like, basically, I'm assigning you somewhat Voltaire writing. It's simply because I want you to read what he writes and somewhat the ideas that he is somewhat spreading throughout somewhat Europe itself, okay? So this is a treatise of Voltaire on somewhat toleration. So if you read this passage itself, he somewhat makes very clear how people of different stripes, different religion, right, are to be viewed, okay? So read this treatise very carefully, right? And in addition to just reading Voltaire, what you might want to do is go back into somewhat the textbook and look up information on Voltaire, right? Understand what does he represent, what time period he lives in, okay? And what does his work represent? What kind of ideas, what kind of argument, what kind of ideologies did Voltaire somewhat promote? Okay, so basically document number 1 is about the Enlightenment, guys. And if that is not clear to you, I have also provided here a link, okay, from Professor Desan, and she talks about somewhat the Enlightenment. It's a quick 30-minute lecture, okay? So I am assigning this to you, right, for you to review in additional to the reading, because again, I want to give you as much information as much as possible. And sometimes what it is, guys, is that you learn in different ways, okay? So you can learn from the reading, but you can also learn by listening. So I'm assigning you here a lecture by Professor Desan from Canopy. It is a film streaming database that is found through the De Anza somewhat library. So all you got to do is basically log in with somewhat the same credentials that you use to log in into Canvas, okay? You log in through Canopy, and once you log into Canopy, you will be able to somewhat view Professor Desan's lecture, okay? 30 minutes on the Enlightenment, and she talks about somewhat Voltaire and Montesquieu and many of the other guys as well, right? So really gives you a strong foundation in terms of what the Enlightenment was about. Because again, guys, I don't want to give the question away, okay? Because you won't see the question until you somewhat start the quiz. So do not start the quiz until you are ready, because you only get one shot at taking the quiz. So you want to make sure that when you are ready, you are completely ready. You have done your preparation, you have reviewed the material, and ultimately you know what these events or what these individuals or what these movements were about. So it's a 30-minute lecture. It's not too long, guys. It's 30-minute on the Enlightenment. So it will give you context. It will help you understand what Voltaire and many of somewhat the philosophers of the Enlightenment movement was about. So that's document number one. So I'm not going to somewhat give away too much answer in terms of what document number one is about, because again, that is your job to assess and analyze and also, guys, summarize, okay? Summarize. Here's the do's and don'ts when it comes to the document-based question exam. Do not spend your time retyping, okay, or copy and paste the same content that is already provided to you, okay? Because again, your strap-on time, you only have 2 hours. And think about it, guys. Remember the rules of the class. Anything that you quote will not count towards your word count, okay? So again, you don't want to pad your word count here and be confused because you don't want to get to the end and you think you have 1,000 words when you really don't, okay? So what I recommend you do is summarize, right? Just summarize, paraphrase what document number one is about in your own words, okay? Maybe like 2 or 3 sentences, what this document is about, what ideas, what does Voltaire talk about, what is the point that he is trying to get at when he's talking about toleration, okay? But that's one of the don'ts of somewhat the document-based question exam. Do not retype and waste your time, okay, retyping word for word what the document is already providing to you. Your job is to summarize, right, in your own words, what Voltaire is talking about, okay? And last but not least, it is going to be also your job to relate what Voltaire and other somewhat Enlightenment thinkers, right, and their train of thoughts is organize it together into one big somewhat umbrella, right, on the Enlightenment and answer the question, right? Trust me, guys, when you see the question, you're not going to be surprised at all because I'm going to try to give it, I'm not going to give it away, but I'm going to try to give you as much somewhat information as possible, okay? So that's document number 2. Here in document, that's document number 1. And here you have document number 2. And document number 2, no different from document number 1, guys. You have another piece of writing. This time it's from a different somewhat philosopher. This is from Rousseau himself, okay? And again, Rousseau, part of somewhat that Enlightenment movement, right? These guys are just writing about what is the connection, what is the responsibility, right, between the people and their government, or at this time, their kings, right? That's what these guys are talking about. And what you have is that these writers, they're really challenging the authority of the king, of divine power here, okay? And how they somewhat challenge the authority of the king, right? You have to read it very carefully in terms of what is the responsibility that governments have to its people, okay? And ultimately, if these are the responsibilities and the duties that a government has to its people, well, what happened when the government doesn't fulfill its end of the bargain, okay? And that's what these guys are talking about, right? And again, I don't want to give it too much away. I also have here another somewhat short lecture, again, on the Enlightenment movement itself, right, as a whole, in terms of to give you more information, to give you more context, what the Enlightenment movement was about, writers like Rousseau, Voltaire. So again, this is something that you will be required to review. So you want to make sure that you're investing the time. Again, it's another 30-minute lecture, but I promise you, if you watch the lecture, right, it will really give you a strong understanding of what these documents are about, what these writers were trying to get at, and ultimately what the Enlightenment was about. Because I promise you, you're going to have to explain what the Enlightenment was about. That's all I can tell you, okay? So that's document number 2. And here's another one that you have. This is John Locke. So I'm giving you pieces of writing from many different somewhat philosophers and writers of the Enlightenment movement, right? We got French, we got Scottish, we have English, and here is John Locke, okay? John Locke, again, the other two lectures in the other documents also mention about John Locke. So I really recommend you also look into your reading to figure out what John Locke made an argument for. And again, in this document, John Locke is trying to explain to the English people what responsibility, right? What duties does a government have, okay? That's it, guys. He's trying to explain to his people, here's why we have government, okay? Here are its duties. Here are its responsibilities, okay? And when a government doesn't fulfill its end of the bargain and protect, right, its subjects, okay, and their somewhat rights, if you will, then the people themselves have the ability, okay, or have the right. Well, I will let you read it. All right, I will let you read it because, guys, without John Locke, there would be no America. I can tell you that right now. Again, I come from an American history background. We are all about John Locke, all right? If anything, Thomas Jefferson should have been somewhat flagged for plagiarism when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Because if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it is very similar. It is almost a copy and paste of what John Locke had written back in 1690. Some people make an argument that the American Revolution is really an extension of the Glorious Revolution that occurred back in 1689. Now, I know it's not within or somewhat time frame, so I'm not going to quiz you on somewhat the Glorious Revolution here, but John Locke was a influential writer, okay, of the American, of his time and also the Enlightenment movement. You cannot talk about the Enlightenment movement without talking about Voltaire, Rousseau, and also John Locke. And what the three of them have in common is they are trying to explain to the people what the relationship should be between people and their governments, okay? What duties does the government have, responsibilities, and also what rights do the people have as well, okay? So that's what you're gonna be looking at. So that's document number 3. No assigned lecture there or anything like that, because I feel like the other two lecture will somewhat give you a strong foundation of what the Enlightenment movement was about. Now, let's get to document number 4. Document number 4, this time, it's not from a dude, okay? It's not from a man. This time, this piece of writing is coming from a woman herself, okay? And Mary Estelle, this is my way of getting you to look at history through different lenses, because the Enlightenment movement itself was not just about a bunch of dudes sitting together in some coffee shop and ultimately inspiring revolutions, okay? Because no revolution would have been possible without the participation and the contribution of women themselves. If anything, it was actually the women who were out on the front lines first, protesting, right? Storming the palace or the Bastille, right? If you will, even in America, it was the Daughters of Liberty that were boycotting, right? I have a joke in my American history class: never underestimate white women and their power to somewhat knit and yarn, okay? Because at the end of the day, it is really women and somewhat their participation and their contribution that makes these revolutions somewhat happen on a ground level. Sure, it is the men that ultimately writes the letters and somewhat the propaganda and somewhat the ideas, but women themselves also contributed as well. They were just not recognized because history is primarily written by men, unfortunately, as a profession. I'm not saying that women didn't write history, but here you have somewhat a sample of Mary Estelle's writing. And what she is really making an argument for is for women themselves, right? To somewhat fight for their rights, somewhat as part of the Enlightenment itself. right? Trying to understand what is their role in society and ultimately what rights do they have, right? So this is my way of letting you somewhat know that women should be part of your analysis, okay? And women themselves, we want to highlight their contributions. We want to highlight somewhat their significance, because again, there would not have been revolutions if it wasn't for women. So here I have another 30-minute lecture, right, on the contributions of women during the revolution. So again, this is to supplement, right, the content from the textbook, because I feel that when it comes to these categories, your textbook, it doesn't do enough, or it doesn't somewhat give justice to the contributions of women themselves. Because again, guys, we want to look at somewhat history from the lens of women as well, and ultimately, how did women carve a place out for themselves, but also made an argument that they too deserve to be part of somewhat of the revolution, and how they should be rewarded, right? So I want you to think about various women writers at the time, okay, and how they somewhat join in on the conversation that was primarily held by men, or sometimes literally counter-replying, right? Or I like to somewhat call it kind of like a clapback, right, towards what the men were criticizing women for, or somewhat stereotype women for being weak, being somewhat inferior. You have women that were really stood up for themselves. So I really recommend you read this passage from Miss Mary Estelle and understand what argument did she make in terms of what women should do, right, in terms of their role in society. And I also have a lecture here that really talks about the contributions of women during the revolutions. So here you have document number 5. This is, again, guys, this is about America, right? This is related to the American Revolution. So here's where you're gonna shift gears a little bit, okay? So far, what you have been looking with the other documents are ideas, okay? Are ideas, okay? By Rousseau, by Voltaire, by Locke, right? And also by women like Estelle herself. So here's where ideas turns into revolutions, okay? That's what you're doing. That's what you're gonna be doing. You're gonna try to figure out, okay? You're gonna try to identify, and you're gonna try to see the influence of the Enlightenment and how it inspired revolutions, and how the revolutions themselves is the reflection, okay, or the embodiment or the fulfillment of those ideas that were laid 100 years ago, or possibly 200 or 300 years ago. And here's where we shift to the revolutions themselves. In document number 5, this should be very familiar to you, okay? This is the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson really lays out the argument as to why the Americans were going to declare their independence from the monarchy. And we give the American Revolution credit where credit is due. The Americans are the first ones, right, that really begins the process we call decolonization. Yes, decolonization, meaning that the colonies are going to break away, right, from the empire and be independent on its own. And in this somewhat document, you can clearly see the ideas of the Enlightenment enshrined in the founding of America. Because when you look at America itself, America is a nation built on not ancestry, right? It's not built on a religion, okay? It's not built on an individual, on a monarchy, but America is a nation built on ideas, okay? Ideas. Your job is to figure out what were those ideas. And I think if you read document number 5, you can clearly see, right, Thomas Jefferson, okay, giving the middle finger to the king and telling him, this is what America is about. And the reason why America is going to declare its independence, because it believes that based on natural laws, right, the king, monarchy, and parliament was not fulfilling their end of the bargain, okay? And as a result, the people themselves, right, have the authority, right, have the natural right to overthrow them. That's basically what this document is about, right, guys? But what you want to do is you want to look at this document very carefully. And I really want, and I recommend to you, figure out where do you see traces of the Enlightenment ideas written within here. So I recommend you go back and look at John Locke's writing, okay? Look at John Locke's writing, because I promise you, Thomas Jefferson, if he was a college student in 1776 and he has submitted this draft of the Declaration of Independence, okay, it would have been flagged for plagiarism with John Locke. So go back to John Locke and figure out what John Locke was saying about government's role and its responsibility to its people. And what happens when the government fails to somewhat provide and to protect its people. What right do people have to do? Okay, so I really want to recommend that to you. And here you actually have 2 lectures, right? Not one, but 2. One on the American Revolution and also one on its influence. Because again, the Americans are going to be the first to declare their independence, but they are going to kick off the process because other countries are going to be inspired by what the Americans did. And as a result, guys, this is why the American Revolution was somewhat so radical, right? So I have 2 lecture videos, again, 30-minute each, okay? It will give you context, right? And a strong foundation as to how the American Revolution was the embodiment of the Enlightenment. But we also want to complicate things too as well, guys, because we don't want to just say that it was the Enlightenment completely, right? It was all the Enlightenment that caused these revolutions. No, it's a mixed bag of everything, okay? It's a mixed bag of everything. And this is where things are going to get really complicated, because if you look at the Enlightenment, those are ideas, okay? Those are ideas. But the question you have to ask yourself is that those ideas, were they the main reasons why these revolutions occurred? Or maybe were there other economic, political factors, okay? Because the Enlightenment, that's a social factor. I want to make it clear, that's a social factor, meaning that it was ideas, culture, okay, that really inspire revolutions, okay? But if you think about it, guys, right? If everything was stable, if the monarchies was able to provide to its people, okay, food, land, money, okay, do you think there would have been revolutions? Okay? That's another important component that you're going to have to figure out as part of your analysis. Because the question is not going to be straightforward, such as, well, explain to me why the Enlightenment caused these revolutions. It's not going to be that simple, guys. Because even though the Enlightenment movement itself laid the foundation for somewhat these ideas, okay, it's actually, your textbook also makes a very clear point that there were other factors as well. And those other factors lies with economics. So for example, would the Americans, would they have declared independence if England never ultimately forced the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Sugar Act, right? The Townsend Duties upon their colonists? And that is the question that you have to ask yourself, is that if everything was normal, if everything was stable, if there was no change, or if there was no stress in the economy, would there have been revolutions? The textbook and I myself would make the argument, I don't give a damn how powerful the ideas are, okay? At the end of the day, it's economics that creates somewhat instability, okay? Tension, conflict internally. And eventually, it's the ideas that shapes how the people respond to their economic conditions. So the American Revolution would not have happened, okay, if it wasn't for the financial crises that occurred. Because what you have is, guys, by 1763, there was an end to the 7 Years' War, and the 7 Years' War was what some historians would categorize as basically the First World War. Okay, this was a war between the superpowers. You have the French going to war somewhat against the English all around the world, North America, the Caribbeans, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East. It's everywhere, okay? And war, guys, costs money, okay? The problem that you have is that these monarchies, okay, after the 1760s, they're running out of money to somewhat maintain their empire. And what happens when monarchies run out of money? They're going to try to get more money. So how do governments get more money? Taxation. And what do we know about people? We hate taxes, right? Nobody likes to pay taxes, guys, right? So that's what we're looking at. And this is where we get to document number 6. Because document number 6, this is where you're going to have to do a little bit of somewhat little accounting skills, if you will, right? You're going to have to look at graphs, okay? And what you look at here is very simple, okay? This is spending that was done by the French monarchy from the 1760s all the way up to the eve of the French Revolution. And this is what I mean when I say it's not just all about the Enlightenment, guys, okay? Here's the economic factor that you have here. Okay, because the problem that you have is France, it's this glowing superpower, it's this growing superpower, right? But guys, comes great power, responsibilities. At the end of the day, you can only spend what you take in. And the problem that you have is that look at the revenue, right? Notice the difference there, that the spending is a lot higher than the actual revenue that the king, right, was taking in. Basically, what you want is you want the revenue to be higher than what you spend, okay? It's that simple, guys. I want you to think it's kind of like your paycheck, right? It's you only get to, every week, you only get paid so much. And when you spend more than that, that's not good, guys. That's called debt, okay? That's not good. So basically, this graph is to illustrate to you the debt that France had accumulated from the 1760s all the way up to the 1780s, okay? So this is me letting you know that you should look at the financial costs of these wars, right? The 7 Years' War, okay? And ultimately, this competition between the two superpowers, the English and the French in Europe, throughout the world, and how it created those distress, bad, troubling economic conditions at home, right? It's kind of like what's going on right now, right? America, we're in this pandemic, right? You have some people says, you know, you got to stay home. You got some people marching out in the street, okay? You got instability. There's only so much instability, and there's only so much starvation and hunger, unemployment. And especially when it comes to the French, they can't go a week without their bread, okay? So as a result, you gotta look at the economic conditions that leads to somewhat uprising, if you will, okay? So that's document number 6. And here's where we get to document number 7. So the question becomes, if these revolutions in the late 18th century was really about the fulfillment of the Enlightenment, okay? And if the Enlightenment is about somewhat the freedom of man, okay? Liberty and equality, okay, then how the hell do you explain, okay, the French Revolution ending with basically a dictatorship of Napoleon? How do we somewhat balance that notion between revolution, okay, Enlightenment ideas, and an emperorship, right? Because you read in the textbook, the French Revolution, it started off good, okay? They met up in the tennis court, right? They somewhat signed the Constitution, but oh man, things get really messy, guys, right? And also, if the French Revolution was about somewhat equality, natural rights, freedoms, and tolerance, then how do you explain Napoleon becoming a dictator at the epicenter of the greatest revolution in the late 18th century in France? How do we come to grips with that? So the question becomes, was the French Revolution about the Enlightenment? Or was it just another coup? Or was it just another uprising? That's what you have to do. So there's a lot of factors you're going to have to somewhat take into consideration, guys, because the question is not going to be straightforward as in, how did the Enlightenment cause the revolution? No, it's not going to be that, right? What you have to understand was there are levels to this, guys. There are somewhat various factors that shape these revolutions. So what is it? Is it the economic problems that caused the revolution? Is it Enlightenment ideas? And if it is Enlightenment ideas, then how do you explain Napoleon? Right? How do you do that? So again, I have somewhat more information, another 30-minute lecture, right, on Napoleon's somewhat reign, right, or his time as ruler, okay? So you're gonna have to figure out how much of Napoleon, okay, during his reign, do you see Enlightenment ideas being fulfilled, or how much of it is a rejection of the Enlightenment? Because not everybody is on board with Enlightenment ideas, guys. Not everybody is on board with the idea of freedom and equality. And speaking of which, this is where we get to somewhat the last document, right? And the last document has to do with another revolution that was in Haiti. This was a revolution that was inspired by another revolution. This is the Haitian Revolution. Something that I don't think the French philosophers or even the Americans had somewhat anticipated. So yes, this is the Haitian Revolution. This was down in Haiti, and you have African slaves, Black Haitians, inspired by the ideas and the principles of the French Revolution, of the American Revolution, to fight for their own freedom, for their own independence. And it's that simple, guys, right? So what you want to do is you want to read the writing of somewhat Toussaint Voltaire, and what you want to look at is what part of his argument for freedom and equality is a reflection and a fulfillment of the Enlightenment itself. Okay? And again, I have another 30-minute, somewhat short lecture that you can watch that will give you a good understanding of what the Haitian Revolution was about. So those are the 8 documents that you get to work with. Okay, I hope it's been clear to you what you will need to do in order for you to somewhat use the documents. Again, at least 6 out of the 8 documents must be part of your analysis. And again, I do not want you to just retype what is already provided to you here. What you should do is you should try to summarize what each document is about in your own words, 2 to 3 sentences, okay? And figure out, okay, what part of the document do you see Enlightenment ideals. And also what part of each document maybe complicates how maybe it wasn't the Enlightenment that sparked and caused the revolution after all. So the point, not to give it away, but you're going to have to analyze the social and the economic, right, causes of those revolutions. It's that simple, okay? And you're going to have to figure out, how does the revolution, in what sense, to what extent is it a fulfillment of the Enlightenment, or possibly maybe a rejection of it, okay? So we don't want to I don't want to give too much away, but that's what the documents are about, guys. And again, the documents, think of them as topics that I'm giving you, right? I'm letting you know, hey, you should talk about the Enlightenment. You should talk about John Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau. You should talk about women. You should also talk about somewhat the revolutions themselves and the economic crises that led up to them, and also talk about how the revolution itself, right, also inspired the fight of slaves to overthrow their master as well, right? Is it a fulfillment of Enlightenment ideas? That is your job to figure out. And here are the key terms that you get to work with, guys. So for every document that you don't use effectively in your essay, it's going to be a deduction of 15 points. And here's another, I apologize for running a little long here, but I'm almost done, guys. Here's another important thing that you should avoid. Do not, I repeat, do not give me 6 document summaries, okay? Let me avoid the confusion here. Do I want you to summarize the document? Yes, I do, okay? But I do not want 6 paragraphs that starts something like this. In document number 1, we can see that it's about Voltaire. In document number 1, Voltaire is talking about so-and-so. In document number 1, Voltaire is a reflection of the Enlightenment. Okay, next paragraph. Document number 2. In document number 2, we can see that it's about Rousseau. In document number 2, this is what Rousseau is talking about. In document number 3, Rousseau is a reflection of the Enlightenment. Guys, no. Okay? Your paragraphs, it has to answer the question. If the goal is for me to just figure out, for you to summarize each document, then I would just ask for 6 summaries. I would need to come up with an essay prompt. The goal here is to use the documents to answer the question. It's evidence. So what does that mean? Your document, the document should not be your topic sentence. I repeat, it should not be your topic sentences, okay? I want you to think of figuring out, right, again, the themes, the events, the ideas that you get to work with, the Enlightenment. So think about the writers, the people, their ideas. You got revolutions, okay? Make the connections, causes, factors, connections, okay? And how important, okay, certain factors are over others. Because at the end of the day, guys, it's not just about ideas, it's also about economic conditions as well. That's what you're gonna have to figure out. But here's where you're gonna have also key terms as well to help you tell a more comprehensive story. So what I recommend you do is try to figure out which key terms relates to what document. Right? You wanna make the connection, okay, guys, right? Use the document, use the key terms, put it together, right, to help you convey and illustrate a comprehensive understanding of a particular topic. So what topics are we gonna be focusing on the exam? It is the Enlightenment and the revolutions that occur in the late 18th century. Causes, okay, of the revolution, how much of it can you credit to the Enlightenment? And if you credit the Enlightenment, where in the revolution do you see the Enlightenment ideals being somewhat reflected? Okay? But I'm going to make this clear. How do you understand, how do you come to grips with the complexities, such as Napoleon, okay? Also, such as the economic conditions. It's not just about the ideas, guys, because it's the ideas that justifies the people's action. But the people, right, they are somewhat pressured or motivated by their economic conditions. Because guys, if everything is well, if everybody's got money, if everybody's fed, nobody's marching out on the street during good times. It's only during bad times when people are out protesting and when you have somewhat rebellions. But what makes it different in the 1770s is that these are not just your normal uprising here. Okay, something changed, something different about these uprisings, and that something different comes from the writing, right? What the revolution was about from the people that participated in it. So that's your job, guys, right? So that's your job. I hope that video has been clear to you. Again, you have a 2-week window to prepare. Okay, so I hope you set aside as much time as possible to prepare. And the ideas that we're focusing on, guys, is the Enlightenment and the revolutions. Okay, the connections between somewhat the two. You're gonna have to also consider somewhat other economic factors as well. And again, guys, use the documents to answer the question. Okay, correlate the document, key terms, back to the question. Again, guys, you're answering the question. I can't tell you how many times I'm going to repeat it. Yeah, I know I'm being repetitive here, but I can't say enough because I want to avoid any confusion. Use the document to answer the question. Okay, I don't want just 6 document summaries. You need to summarize the documents, but you need to correlate it back to the question. So I hope that's clear. Okay. And also, guys, you want to make sure that you invest the time. So I think I assign about like 5 or 6 lecture videos. So if you think about it, half an hour a piece, that's about 2 or 3 hours you're going to have to invest in order for you to somewhat review those lectures as well. So you want to make sure that you're spending as much time as possible to prepare for this exam. And if you need help in terms of understanding what the document, what the DBQ format is about, if this hasn't been clear to you, I really want to recommend you here to go to Khan Academy. They do a great job at explaining to you what the DBQ is about. If you need help to figure out how to read primary resources, here's another link for you. If you also need help in terms of how to cite and also how to quote from the sources, I have sources here available to you. So 2 hours, okay? You have 2 weeks to prepare, 2 hours to complete the test. When you take the test, you want to make sure that you are in a quiet, distraction-free environment, because once you start, guys, the clock ticks. Okay, you can't pause it. It's just gonna keep ticking until the 2 hour expire. Okay, so you have 2 hours. You can use your books, right? You can have your notes in front of you. Okay, but you want to make sure that you are writing in your own words. Okay, no plagiarism. And also how you're going to be graded, guys. This is how you're going to be graded right here, right? Your thesis. Okay, how sophisticated is your thesis? Okay, how developed is your argument? Okay, how strong is your argument? How you use the documents? Do you use it effectively? Do you use it creatively? Are you organizing your information in a organized, cohesive manner? And also, guys, go beyond the documents, okay? Go beyond the documents. What I mean by is this, okay? Okay? So for this document now, right here, right? Document number 7, yes, it is the coronation of Napoleon. Yes, I see that he's holding a crown. Yes, I see that it's in a fancy building. People are wearing a lot of fancy right? Yes, I see all of that. Do not waste your time to write what my eye can see in words. Yes, this is the coronation of Napoleon. But the bigger point is what we mean by contextualizing is, do you understand why the coronation is important? Meaning, why is Napoleon important to the question? What does his reign represents? Okay? That's what it's about. How much information can you pull about Napoleon to tell me about the empire that he built and how it relates to the question. Do not waste your time to re-describe what my eye can see, okay? Oh, a picture is worth 1,000 words, guys. So let the picture speak for itself. So you need to provide the context. You need to bring in relevant information that is relevant to Napoleon. This is my way of letting you know, hey, you should talk about Napoleon. Do not just talk about what is into painting, right? Talk more about Napoleon, right? So be careful of that, guys, because again, you want to use the document effectively, right? You want to provide context, and also you want to bring information beyond the document, right? That's where the key terms come in, guys, right? Use the key terms to help you tell a comprehensive understanding of a particular topic. So what particular topics we're talking about? The Enlightenment movement and its writers, right? Both men and women, okay? And then we want to look at the causes of the revolution themselves. Was it inspired by the Enlightenment, or was it caused by something else, okay? And last but not least, we want to look at how much of, in these revolutions, do we see reflection of Enlightenment ideas? So that's all I can tell you for now. I hope that this video has been informative, been clear, and I hope it helps you in your somewhat preparation. And again, guys, you want to set as much time as possible to somewhat complete this assignment, because again, it's not designed to be completed last minute. Okay, guys? So with that said, I apologize for taking a little long here, but you got a lot of work to do. So get to it, guys. But if you have any question, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you. But other than, guys, best of luck, okay? And I will somewhat see you in the second somewhat exam, all right? Best of luck, guys. And if you need help, let me know. Thanks.